In today's political lexicon, populism is now synonymous with Donald Trump, with Brexit, with right-wing politics, and with an undesirable rebellion against stable political institutions. But is populism always a bad thing? My guest today rejects this basic premise and has been working his entire political career to try to understand and harness the potential good side of populist movements here in Canada. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. It's a pleasure and an honor today to be joined by Mr. Preston Manning. Preston Manning is one of the most prominent conservative politicians and political leaders in Canadian history and has a thorough understanding of the rise of populism in Canada and around the world. He's often called the father of modern-day Canadian conservatism. Preston was a founder and the only leader of the Reform Party of Canada, which became the Canadian Alliance Party, which eventually merged with the Progressive Conservative parties to form the Conservative Party of Canada, which was led by Stephen Harper and was held government for nearly a decade. Although no longer a politician, Preston remains a prominent voice in Canadian politics and is in promoting Western Canadian interests. In 2005, Preston created the Canada Strong and Free Network. Well, it was called the Mending Centre before, and now it's called the Canada Strong and Free Network. The group has helped shape national conversations around conservatism, influence government policies, and help create a university program at Carleton University, the first program aimed at political management. So, Preston, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to speak to you today.
Well, thank you very much. It's great.
Okay, well, I want to first start off by talking a little bit about just what just happened in our country with the Trucker Convoy, the sort of political uprising against the Trudeau government, and how it was handled by both Justin Trudeau, his government, as well as the media here in Canada. I think the audience knows my position on this issue thoroughly, but I'm wondering what is your take? How do you think it folded out? How do you think it could have been handled differently by the politicians and the media in this country?
Well, I think I know some truckers, independent truckers. Our family has a small ranching operation. We use truckers to take cattle to community pastures and to processing plants. But I felt this truckers' convoy was a legitimate expression of concern by people who were affected by the vaccine mandates. In their case, it put some 15,000 of them out of work. And I feel it was a legitimate bottom-up political protest. It had these populist dimensions. And the sad thing was the way the federal government responded to it. They wouldn't even meet with these people. And the prime minister immediately characterized them as extremists and that this was financed or originated in the United States, which is completely false. So I think it was a legitimate expression of political concern by a legitimate group of people, and that the Ottawa government responded inappropriately.
Well, I mean, just beyond that, if it was a legitimate and peaceful movement of a group of people who just wanted their demands to be heard, and the response wasn't just to dismiss them, smear them, refuse to meet with them, but actually use a emergency act that had never been invoked before, was created in 1988 with the desired impact of use only during severe national emergencies and potentially war. What kind of precedent does it set as a government who's so unwilling to talk to a group of people that he would take such drastic action against them?
Yeah. Well, I think it was an enormous overreaction, and the question it raises is the question you're raising: if the Trudeau government would overreact to legitimate protests like that by invoking the Emergency Act, on what other occasions would they do the same thing? And I feel that the justification for invoking the Emergency Act was never really proven by the government. They very hastily retreated from it. But again, it's just an extreme overreaction and a misunderstanding, or a deliberate misunderstanding of what these people were trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish.
What are the things that was striking to me about the people who were behind the Trucker Convoy, the people who characterized the protests in Ottawa, was sort of the difference between them and the normal people, the normal type of people you see in Canadian political life, the normal kind of people that you see protesting. It's usually sort of aggrieved left-wing people who protest, who go out and gather on Parliament Hill and who occupy. The whole Occupy movement came from Occupy Wall Street, which was an anti-capitalist left-wing movement. what do you think about the idea that many of these truckers were sort of apolitical or not necessarily politically engaged, and the sort of the action of them coming and becoming political, coming to Ottawa, was met with such scorn and name calling? How do you think that'll impact those individuals or the individuals who supported them?
I think it shows to Canadians the contempt that the Ottawa elites have for just ordinary folks, and the fear that they seem to have of them, and then the inconsistencies when left-wing protesters shut down rail lines that carry 20% of Canada's exports to Asia over them. The government almost sided with the protesters and didn't regard this as an emergency. But somebody shuts down the bridge at Windsor, and this is a national catastrophe, calling for the invoking of the Emergency Act. The inconsistency in that response, in addition to its overhandedness and inappropriateness, I think all of this, the net effect of it, is to reduce the confidence of Canadians increasingly in the Trudeau administration. This is just one of a number of things, but it adds to the list.
What do you think of the sort of class divide that was on display? I know that many people in government and media have dismissed this idea that what we saw was a sort of working class uprising that was dismissed and disregarded by a group of elites in Ottawa. But you can't help but notice the sort of the idea that there's a New York Times op-ed that put it really well, and it sort of talked about the not necessarily class divide, but the difference between people who live their life virtually, whose jobs that can be done remotely, can be done on a computer. COVID didn't really have a huge impact on them, versus people who lived in the practical world. So they had virtuals versus practicals. People who lived in the practical world are the ones that own small businesses, that own restaurants, that drive trucks, that work at the frontline workers. The people who've been harmed disproportionately by COVID were many of the sort of loudest voices praising and pushing the Trucker Convoy, because they've gone out to the real world and lived in COVID, and they're ready to move on. Whereas the people who are kind of sheltered behind their screens haven't had to have the same interaction. And many of them are legitimately and reasonably perhaps afraid to go back out into the world. And so you kind of have these two different camps of people that are very much have different interests, and perhaps it's hard for them to understand what it's like to be on the other side. But certainly the sort of virtual side, or the elites disregarding the working class or the practicals, was really quite stark. Did you notice a sort of class element to these protests?
I don't think the establishment even understands how its messaging was impacting or being received or even being considered relevant by those people. I mentioned the ranching operation. You have guys that are looking after cattle sitting in a mobile home on a wintering quarter that I know of, is watching this nice lady on TV in a warm studio in Edmonton or Ottawa telling them to stay home and be safe. Well, these guys start to laugh. If we stay in here, those cattle won't get fed. Our job by city standards is never considered safe. But so just a complete lack of resonance of that message with people that were in those situations. And this is true for thousands and thousands of workers, particularly in the resource sectors, that are out there doing something, whether it's agriculture or energy or mining or forestry or the fishery. You take Aboriginal people. I mean, I think the mining sector in BC is the largest single employer of Aboriginal people, but they're out there doing things. They can't stay home and be safe the way this message is coming to them from the health authorities. So that lack of resonance between the source of the message and the receiver is part of the root of this misunderstanding, I think, over the whole COVID crisis.
That's such a good point. I want to touch on populism, because I know this is an area that you've talked about and worked on a long time. I listened to your podcast with Jordan Peterson where you talked about sort of positive populism. I hope you could sort of help us understand, because usually it's used as a negative word to describe people who are trying to sort of undermine the political stability. But you see a different side of populism. So I'm hoping you can sort of talk a little bit about what populism means.
It's so unfortunate that populism is misunderstood by Canadians. And I've argued, and I think I can prove it, that Western Canada's had more experience with populist movements, populist parties, and populist governments than virtually any other part of North America. And while populism has its wild and woolly side, the Canadian experience with it, let's say in the 20th century, has been relatively positive. And just to give a few examples, the first woman that got elected to the Parliament of Canada, how did she get there? Through what movement? She didn't get there through the Liberals or the Conservatives in that day. The Liberals did everything in their power to knock her out of that Parliament, and eventually they did. She came up through the old Progressive movement, which is basically a farmers movement, which was a populist bottom-up party. The so-called famous five, the women that got women elected or recognized as persons in Canadian law, all five of them were populists. Two or three of them were elected as populists to the Alberta legislature. So there's populism can accomplish some pretty positive things. Whether you agree with Canadian Medicare or not, that came out of Saskatchewan through the CCF, which was a bottom-up populist party, particularly at that time. It was the champion of that particular social reform, the constitutional change that got natural resources finally, the ownership of natural resources recognized in terms of the provinces, particularly the Western provinces. That was achieved by farmers' governments, the UFA in Alberta, a small group of progressives in the federal parliament. So you can list off these positive accomplishments by populist movements and populist governments. Now, it doesn't mean they don't have a wild and woolly side, and whether they end up making that positive contribution or whether they turn negative very, very much depends on the leadership, and it depends on the reaction of the establishment. Most of these populist parties and governments are a reaction to what was there before. Trump is the legacy of Obama. Doug Ford is the legacy of Catherine Ford in Ontario. So I argue there's a positive side if they're properly led and properly understood.
Well, so it's interesting now because you sort of see different camps in the Conservative Party right now. You know, Erin O'Toole stepped down, and without a certain leader, there's sort of different elements of the party popping up. What would your advice be to the Conservative Party and anyone looking to run it on how best to connect with the grassroots, how to utilize the sort of success and the growth of the Trucker Convoy in helping to sort of steer the party in more of a positive populist way that really connects with voters, connects with the grassroots, understands their concerns, and can relay those messages to Ottawa without the sort of effect of being in Ottawa for too long, which is that you start to sound more like the establishment and less like the people who sent you there?
Well, I think you use the right word when you say connect. I think the first step is to connect with them. And the first step to connecting with people is just to listen to them. Just to listen to them. And I use the analogy, and I think you've heard me on this before, of in the oil patch, there's such a thing as a wildcat well that's drilled into a formation where you don't know what's down below. And then there's such a thing as a rogue well that drills into a formation where there's an enormous amount of oil or gas under pressure. And it can be very dangerous. It can blow the drilling platform off the wellhead. It can catch fire. It can be enormously dangerous. But one of the ways of bringing a rogue well under control is you drill in a relief well from the side. And the angle has to be right. If it's too shallow, it won't take off enough pressure. If it's too deep, it can turn into a rogue well. But if it's just right, it can take off enough pressure that valves can be installed, and all that valuable energy can be harnessed to useful purposes. But the important thing there is that relief well has to connect with that whatever is underneath that rogue well. You have to identify with whatever is causing all this energy and all this this activity, and that's the first step. And in a sense, that's what reform was in the 1980s. There was a strong anti-federal government, anti-federal party atmosphere in Western Canada. It produced separatist movements. Separatist Party elected a member to the Alberta legislature, and what reform did was drill in that relief well from the side. And so we had to identify with what was making those people mad. We say, yeah, you got a right to be mad, and we're mad too, but instead of blowing the whole thing up, how about doing this, this, and this? Senate reform, balance the budget, regional impact assessments, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's the challenge for, as there's populism developing today. I think it's going to be very interesting whether this freedom convoy morphs into a broader common sense movement of some kind. But the challenge for the political leadership, conservative and others, will be to identify with the root causes of it and then propose better alternatives, perhaps, in how to achieve the objectives.
One of the things that I see as sort of a clash within conservatism, within the conservative movement, is that conservatives by nature, the reason that they're conservatives is because they want to conserve something. So they tend to, be patriotic and supportive of our institutions and our networks that have created this sort of very stable, prosperous society. But at the same time, in Canada, the institutions that we have are also built and crafted around sort of big L liberalism in many ways, Preston. And a lot of the institutions are simply not holding up to scrutiny under the pressures of COVID, the reality, for instance, of the media landscape. One of the things that was just so, I observed it over the entire period of COVID, but during the protest, just so blatantly obvious how corrupted and how focused on a narrative and not willing to look outside and not willing to paint an objective picture to Canadians. There's so many examples, but to a almost partisan sense, the media is corrupted. How do you think that this relationship between protecting institutions and a need to identify and remove corrupted institutions or institutions that are no longer serving their good? How do you think that conservatives can kind of approach and fix this issue?
You got to make the argument, and it's not made much in the public arena, that it's possible to both conserve an institution and to change it for the better at the same time. That conservation and change are not mutually exclusive. In fact, you could argue they almost have to go together. Edmund Burke argued this, that he was all for conserving certain things, but he advocated certain things had to change in order to conserve them. And I think that argument needs to be refined. One of my own illustrations, I used to do community development work up in north central Alberta, and there was a sign on an old road away back in the bush, and it was on a big post and had a huge crossbar on it. It had one word on it, Saw Ridge, and an arrow pointing west. And it was supposed to tell you how to get to the town of Sawridge. The only problem with it was if you followed that sign, you'd never get to Sawridge. Well, why was that? The sign never changed. The sign always said the same thing. It always pointed in the same direction. It was as conservative as you can get. But during the years back, there was a flood that the town of Sawridge had to move its location. It changed its name to the town of Slave Lake. The roads to get there had been changed half a dozen times. So the very fact that the sign didn't change was a source of error rather than truth. And so and I think there's a lesson in that you got to have signposts and you got to have them firm in the ground and everything else. But sometimes what's on them has to change in order to get to the original objective. And I think that's true whether you're talking about how to conserve democracy or a viable private sector in the economy. And if conservatives could refine that, we want to conserve, here's what we want to conserve, but here's the changes we want to make in order to, I think people could understand it. I think they could understand that.
And just going back to the point you made earlier about how when the Reform Party came around as sort of a relief valve for those who were sort of fed up with the status quo, the result was very real and substantive change. I mean, talking about some of the things that you mentioned, what the Conservatives stood for was really sort of an overhaul of some of the institutional decay that was happening. Do you think we're at a time now, this is what, 30, 40 years after the birth of the reform movement, we're ready for another set of drastic reforms to our political system to save it?
I think you have to do this every so often. When the Reform Party was put together, the lawyer that put its constitution together was a fellow by the name of Bob Muir, a real fine lawyer in Calgary. And when we were talking about it, I said, Bob, I want a clause, in a sunset clause in the constitution of this party. Well, he says, well, what do you mean? Well, I want it to come to an end in 10 years. if the party members decide to just renew it the way it is, they can. But I want a sunset clause in it. And by golly, we had one in there. And it was to be 10 years. That the party would cease to exist unless the members reinstituted it and recreated it, either in its original form or something else. And by golly, by 1997, it was clear that reform had gone about as far as we could go with it, and we needed this bigger, broader thing. We wanted to form an alliance with the, particularly the provincial Conservatives in Alberta, Manitoba, and Mike Harris in Ontario. And that's what gave the opportunity to create the Canadian Alliance, which then morphed into the Conservative Party of Canada. So you don't want to do this every day. You don't want to rethink your fundamental principles or organizations every day. I mean, political parties have to have some continuity and stability. But I think periodically, and particularly in the age in which we live, when change is so fast, everything else is changing, that there should be a recognition every so often. We got to make some fundamental changes in order to be relevant or to be able to address the problems that are confronting the country. The federal Liberals to do this is going to end up being their Achilles heel. And in a way, I think one of the consequences of this COVID thing is there's going to have to be changes in leadership. There's rumblings within the federal Liberals already that Trudeau has to go. People looking for Mark Carney or somebody else. There's rumbles within the NDP. You've got the NDP members that come from ridings where they've got private sector union members who've lost their jobs and their incomes. And these guys are starting to resent the support of the public sector unions. There's other people in the NDP that support them who were not only protected throughout this whole thing, some of them got wage increases. So you've got internal forces there that are going to force the NDP to decide where it's going to go. So you've got internal forces for leadership changes within the Liberals, within the NDP. It's already starting. In this sense, the Conservative Party of Canada is ahead of the others. And that's one of the consequences of this turmoil that's been created by the COVID crisis.
Okay, well, let's shift and talk a little bit about COVID, because when you look at the Trucker Convoy, even though sure they got cleared out with excessive force by police, but some of the things that they were advocating for, they started to see real impact almost immediately. Preston, Quebec reversed its vaccine mandate tax, anti-vax tax. If you weren't vaccinated, you were going to get an extra tax. They reversed that almost immediately. Several of the provinces have since lifted most of their restrictions. We have seen the major points that the truckers were advocating for, those goals were accomplished. So let's talk a little bit about the post-COVID agenda. What should it look like in Canada, and how can we get there?
Well, I think one way to come at the agenda is to look at what has the COVID crisis, what weaknesses has it revealed in our systems that are going to have to be addressed, and one of them is just the whole way the thing was managed. So I think one of the things on the post-COVID agenda is going to be an investigation into law. It probably won't be done by this government, but if it's the federal government's replaced, I think that'd be one of the first things any new government would do. It'll appoint a commission of some sort to get at what went wrong in the management of the crisis. And then what was another weakness that was revealed? Well, what was the weakness of the Canadian healthcare system? That the Canadian Medicare is 60 years old and was simply incapable of meeting the surge in demand that the COVID crisis feels. So what are we going to do about that? What changes, healthcare changes, are we going to make? And we got to look at other countries. The countries that had mixed systems, public and private systems, were able to cope with the surge in demand better than our system. So that's going to be another list thing on the agenda for the post-COVID period will be that sort of healthcare reform thing. And then a third thing will be what has to be done to better protect the rights and freedoms that people thought were guaranteed by the Constitution. It was clear that the government could override those, that there were literally millions of violations of the so-called sacred rights in the Constitution. And so what's going to be done to address that? I think one of the areas you're going to get into there, and you're familiar with this, there's a test called the Oakes test. It comes out of a legal case in 1986, where the Supreme Court of Canada said, if you're going to limit the rights and freedoms that are guaranteed in the Constitution, the government has to demonstrate, it's the government that has to demonstrate that the benefits of the limitation outweigh the negative impacts. Now, that was never done in this case. If you want to show that your limitation outweighs the negative impacts, for one thing, you got to measure the impacts, or at least try to estimate it. There was never any impact assessment made on the health protection measures as to what their impact would be on the health system itself, let alone on the civil liberties of Canadians. And there was never any economic impact assessment done on those health protection measures. And so I think that's something that's going to have to be written into law. You want to limit those rights in the Constitution, you've got to show that the impacts that the benefits outweigh the impact, and you've got to make an assessment of the impacts, or else the courts will declare whatever your health protection measure is, your protection measure is as unconstitutional. So I see this list, an investigation into what went wrong and what went right with respect to the management, what has to be done with the healthcare system, because this crisis proved it to be inadequate. What are the additions to the what has to be done to strengthen the protection of rights and freedoms, because obviously whatever we had before wasn't sufficient. And I can see a list of about 8 things being a part of the post-COVID agenda that somebody's going to have to get after. And one of them is even that thing you mentioned before, is leadership changes. What changes have to be made in the leadership of the federal political parties in order to make some progress on that agenda?
One of the things, I mean, we've been talking about populism and the sort of rise of the anti-COVID mandates and practices, that we saw with the Trucker Convoy. One of the things I was talking on a panel earlier with John Williamson, who's an MP out in New Brunswick, and I hear a lot of people criticizing the Conservatives for not standing up against these abuses against our charter, for not standing up and talking about the healthcare issues, and he mentioned that, at the time, during the kind of height of COVID and for the last 2 years, public opinion has not really been on the side of freedom. People were afraid. People were very worried. They wanted lockdowns. They wanted mandates. They wanted, people who, the example that John used, were that people who refuse to get vaccinated, they shouldn't just lose their job and their pension and their EI. They should also get removed from our healthcare system and not be like denied access if they needed healthcare. And I saw a lot of that sentiment in the media as well. There's a infamous Toronto Star front page that said, "Let them die. I hope unvaccinated people die," and that was sort of the narrative that we're hearing from media and the sentiment. And I personally noticed a lot of sort of adversarial combativeness among Canadians that frankly struck me as un-Canadian. People fighting on social media, fighting with their families, disinviting people to Christmas dinner. What could be done about these sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, like a totalitarian impulse of people when it came to an emergency to just use every law possible? And how can we mend these? It's a divided country right now. How can we start to mend some of these divides that have been really, really evident throughout the pandemic?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that can be done. One is that there has to be a discussion on the appropriateness of these measures. And this business of the cancel culture, we can't talk about that because it's already been decided, whatever. I think that has to be very strenuously resisted. And the way one resists it is by insisting that it be talked about, whether it's in your own family or in your own circle or in your own company or in your own community. The second is to take some of these polls with a grain of salt, because a lot depends on how you ask the question. If when at the height of the controversy over the truckers, the only question you asked is should the Emergency Act be invoked in order to make these people adhere to the vaccine mandates, and all you've heard is the propaganda from the government when it introduced this, it's not surprising that 50% of Canadians would say, yeah, I guess that's what you should do. If you ask the question, which of these two options would you prefer? Stopping the truckers by simply canceling the vaccine mandates which caused the protest in the first place, or invoking the Emergencies Act, which came out of the War Measures Act? Which of those is, I think a lot of average people say, no, just cancel the mandates that caused this. Other countries are already doing it. The provinces are already doing it. So it very much depends on how you ask the question. And then the third thing is that polls will give you a measure of where the public's head is at today, but you don't have to assume that's where it's going to be for 3 months or 4 months from now if you work on trying to change it. And I recall back in our day when the Charlottetown Constitutional Court came out. It was announced by the prime ministers, and all 10 of the premiers said it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And the first polls that said, well, public said, I guess it's a good thing. Everybody else seemed to think had 65% support. But after a debate, because that had to go to a national referendum, that side lost. People changed their minds. And the people that opposed that accord, which included ourselves, that became what the majority position was. But it took some time. So I think there's things that can be done, but somebody has to do them. Institute the discussion, the counter discussion, frame the questions in some different ways that reveal some different options, and then persist if you really think you're on the right track. And eventually you can bring people around to it. Persist on that until you do.
Well, I think that's very good advice. Hopefully the future leadership of the Conservative Party will take note and try to lead rather than just following the polls. Unfortunately, we've seen too many politicians who govern that way, Preston. Well, I really appreciate your time. It's so delightful to speak to you and hear your wisdom on Canadian politics. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Candice. It was really a pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.